Great. Excellent. So I will try to speak without this. I'm not sure if you don't hear me, just ask me to use the microphone. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to be here today. I think I'm going to bring a slightly different perspective in relation to post-growth, because I thought to be quite important to actually also address human-nature relations in this sort of discussion. So in my talk, I'm going to bring you an art-based perspective on green space design. And that's actually a way to start to reflect on human-nature relations, what they are currently, but also what could be otherwise. And maybe more generally kind of thinking about the potential role of art-based methods and theories in designing for sustainability transitions. And in my work, I typically use creative methods as a mode of conducting transdisciplinary research. So I typically work with artists and designers in co-production kind of modes. And that's actually a way to produce knowledge, right? So not so much an added layer to my research, but actually something that we do through a variety of projects. And this particular presentation is based on a paper which should be forthcoming. So hopefully by the end of the year, then if anyone is curious, I can share it in a special issue of Designing for Transitions in the World Futures Review. It's actually co-authored with my PhD student, Tamara van den Eyden, and it's based on materials from a project in which we are involved, the Horizon Europe project called Biotraces. You see it up there. It's basically a project aiming to develop a grounded theory for transformative change for nature-positive societies. And we work with a specific case that is going to be kind of showing on and off here in the slides. From Amsterdam, Food Park Amsterdam. So this is our societal partner and research case. Yeah, so as a starting point to think about human-nature relations, I thought, well, it might be quite interesting to think about how or look at how green space is portrayed in urban development policy, right? So typically we see green space as primarily green infrastructure that has certain characteristics. So you can think here of like parks, open spaces. You have a variety of green spaces here, cycle paths, green roofs, green walls, etc. Right? So all of these things are typically managed by humans for specific purposes, like recreation, mobility, and of course, environmental services. This is quite key. So, for example, in terms of flood defense or to provide kind of measures for air pollution or maybe heat island effects, which, of course, in cities are quite problematic in some parts. So you could say that then green space becomes a solution, right, to achieve healthy and climate resilience cities and living environments. So that sounds very good. I mean, why not? Maybe this is actually how we are taught in design schools, right? But I find it actually to be quite problematic as a vision because it's actually quite limiting and also quite technocratic in the sense that it doesn't tell the full story. And also, even more problematically, it doesn't address the root cause and also kind of the worldviews that actually are preventing us from addressing the current ecological crisis and also achieving sustainability transitions, or rather transformations, which is also quite key in terms of terminology. So then in this context, my proposition is that actually in order to achieve all of these transformations and kind of more sustainable futures, we actually have to address and rethink human-nature relations, so the relations between humanity and nature. And so these pictures that you see here actually tell a different story about green space. So they're pictures from, or images rather, from or related to our research case in Amsterdam, from the southwest of Amsterdam. And they tell a story of this kind of conflicting values between how we see or how we relate currently with nature, which is primarily for exploitation, extractivist practices, for human purposes, or often financial purposes. And again, this has an issue within this kind of, well, moving towards post-growth futures. And at the same time, also contrasting with alternative socio-ecological values. So what you see here, this particular land, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this case, is in Luktamir polder. So it's basically what is considered to be the last fertile soil of Amsterdam, is on the very edge of the city, basically where the rural starts. It's quite interesting. I saw a map recently that actually shows that this site is precisely at the edge, and then the rural kind of environment starts, including Schiphol Airport and so on. So it's quite interesting because it's currently undergoing struggle between the aims of a civic activist initiative called Food Park Amsterdam. They're trying to preserve and reclaim this land as an agroecological commons. And of course, you have the Municipality of Amsterdam. They're trying to use it for industrial purposes and to develop well, some kind of distribution centers for stuff that probably we don't need. So that's basically one of those buildings that we already have there. And these kinds of things are encroaching also in the rest of the space. But while maybe that's, of course, very important to reimagine or, well, to rethink human-nature relations is not exactly easy. And it requires processes of reimagining these relations and also kind of coming up with these alternative narratives that basically question the status quo, but at the same time also maybe make room for other possibilities. And in this context, this is where we start to see how art-science interactions and collaborations are actually quite important because and also many sustainability scholars have started to collaborate with artists, designers, and so on in their research, because artistic practices are seen, and more generally creative practices, are seen to offer this potential to allow us to see the world otherwise, right? So they allow us to envision alternative futures, maybe open up or make more tangible and experiential certain future possibilities in ways that maybe we start to see also how the future might be like and potentially initiate action. So within this sort of context, there are a variety of what have been called imaginative logics. So basically a variety of kind of futuring techniques involving art and design practices. And here are some examples. They were discussed in a paper, a relatively recent paper that presented the results of the post-fossil city competition. I think that was in The Hague a few years back. And one of them, which to us, so to me and Tamalone, when we're kind of looking at this topic, drew our attention, is this notion of defamiliarizing. So this comes from artistic theory, specifically aesthetic theory. And in the papers is kind of just very briefly highlighted, but then we kind of, particularly through Tamalone, we want to be deeper into the topic. And we discovered that actually could be a very effective way to basically make strange, right? So to kind of destabilize what we take for granted, current meanings and understandings. And in that sense, also kind of make space for looking at the problem differently. So basically reframing the problem and then allowing us to start to rethink other possibilities. So basically how we do that, in our research, we use this term Rurban, precisely as a way to defamiliarize or maybe make strange this, or destabilize, you could say, this sort of predetermined understandings of what is rural and what is urban. So in that way, it's also a way for us to make room for other understanding, other kind of human nature relations, different reflections on those. And what we see here, rural and urban, I guess, of course, here we're in an urban school, right? So rural and urban are very, they're opposite, right? So we see also definitions, they're perceived as antonyms. But this is actually, I think, part of the problem, because precisely we create this sort of separation between what is perceived to be important to happen in rural environments to put urban environments. So, for example, food production versus food consumption, right? So you separate these notions and kind of entities, production, consumption. I think these are actually at the core of many of our present crises, right? For example, including climate change and biodiversity loss. So in our research, basically, we use this terminology precisely to kind of address this dichotomy. And just out of curiosity, because this kind of space, to me, illustrates such a urban environment. I imagine some of you might be familiar with it. Yeah, so who could tell, because it used to be that space. It's not there, unfortunately, anymore. Yeah. So maybe...
It's in Paris.
Yeah, exactly. It's in Paris, right? So you'd imagine is, well, it's unclear, right? So obviously it's in Paris, in a highly dense and a big city. You wouldn't imagine of such space necessarily there, but such a space was there. But of course, for various local political issues, now actually become a car park. So unfortunately, it's not there anymore. But these possibilities exist, right? So how we do this in our research, how we use this notion of urban to defamiliarize. Basically, we work with creative practitioners, with artists and designers, and we co-produce creative methods that combine our, let's say, academic knowledge with artistic practice. in relation to specific Rurban context. Typically, methods are very context-specific. And the idea is here is to create this, what we call situated Rurban encounters with specific issues that happen in those contexts. So this is what is this notion of situated urban encounters. I'm going to give you now a couple of examples from 2 different workshops just to illustrate how we're doing this. So the first workshop I'm going to talk about is happened, actually both of them happened last year. This first one is in relation to precisely that site in Luktamir Polder. It was a speculative design workshop that we co-produced with designer Lisa Mandemacher. And in order for us to also be relevant to the initiative, we connected to a campaign that they had at the time, which was called Give Voice to the Soil. And this is what also kind of generated the title, Listening to the Soil. And the whole aim of the workshop was to see how, by using creative approaches, how can we engage participants from outside the initiative? So even those who don't know about the site, or maybe have no, they're not particularly curious, because typically it's kind of commons movements or initiatives are still quite kind of protective of what they're doing, or they don't necessarily allow or rather don't necessarily engage with them. So we're curious to see how we can engage also others, the specificity of the site, the kind of types of green space that we have there, as a way to also provoke other imaginations about green space in cities, or how we really could relate with nature in cities. So involved 40 high school students from a nearby international school. Young people, right? So this was actually for us quite interesting to see how do they kind of engage in this particular process. And of course, we're hosted by a specific site. So what is also important here in the subtitle is that it also illustrates what we're trying to do in the workshop, which was to decenter the human perspective onto the world, and also to kind of make space for make space for attention to other needs and values. So this is what the Becoming Underground Astronaut comes from, because, of course, as humans, we've been very curious about, the outer space. Planets produce a lot of technology to look somewhere beyond, but somehow we fail to look at what happens under our feet, right? To actually the soil that nourishes us. So for us, this was an interesting play with words. So basically, to the task of this particular workshop, so how to kind of put them in that position of becoming more attentive to what happens underneath our feet, was to, let's say, imagine, also prototype speculative tools that an underground astronaut might use in the future to listen to the soil. So this was actually the listening aspect would have been interpreted in a variety of ways, as hearing, but also as sensing in a variety of human senses, but also caring for something underneath our feet. And we put them in a non-human perspective. So we specifically asked the groups to address a specific perspective. And we had here fungi, bacteria, earthworms, and roots. They had to work in groups, and they actually had to work on the ground, on these canvases, precisely in the orchard that is present. It's a very old orchard, apple orchard, is present on the site of this initiative. So they had to prototype these tools, and also using a variety of materials, also by tinkering with all kinds of discarded things, crafting materials, they could produce their tools. So of course, what was interesting here is that the whole point of defamiliarization is that you have to exit your comfort zone, hence you become uncomfortable with certain things. So this was a question which was meant to be funny at the beginning of the workshop, but at the same time, I think kind of illustrated how the kids were somewhat taken by surprise with, okay, but how can we listen to the soil if worms don't speak English? So this is quite interesting. Of course, this school is positioned in a highly dense area of Amsterdam, so the kids are probably not particularly concerned with soil other than, I don't know, dirt on their clothes or something. But it might also tell of alienation of young people from nature. So this could be another kind of a deeper dimension of all of this. But basically, after this kind of first kind of unsettling questions, eventually they started to work together. They were inspired by being outside, which is, again, unusual. Maybe from a pedagogical perspective, it's quite interesting to be somewhere else than in your classroom. To work together, they were in close proximity to the land. They had to play with all of these different things. And eventually they produced really interesting outcomes. So, for example, we have a few examples here. One of them had to do with a device which somehow listened to what happened and kind of translated the health of bacteria into colors, colorful lights and sounds. So it's an interesting idea. But we could also see, so these are some reflections after the workshop. They had to write their reports for their teachers, and we got some of these quotes. I think it's interesting because we could see maybe a shift in meaning about soil, right? So while, of course, there was a certain maybe uneasiness or, yeah, in a sense, kind of dismissing perhaps this kind of open-ended and not particularly scientific approaches, but eventually they seem to become more attentive or at least gain some knowledge about what they call here inconspicuous species in the dirt. So then maybe soil takes a different meaning, which is not just as dirt, but perhaps, again, something full of life. So that was quite interesting. And then the other one was specific about green space, which seems to be also a shift in perspective on green space beyond just like utilitarian purposes, right, to provide some kind of environmental services, but something for the well-being of communities. Communities could be, here you can start to imagine extended communities of humans and non-humans. So it seemed interesting. Now, this is the second workshop, and this is also very interesting in the sense that we developed it with an artist called Maris Vart. So I don't know, maybe some of you might be familiar. She's part of, she's been working on a very interesting project with other people from her collective called the Traveling Farm Museum of Forgotten Skills. So they're associated with Casco Art Institute in Utrecht. And I've been working with her since my time in Utrecht University, and basically the way we conceived this workshop was as a walk shop, so combining a walk with a co-design activity. And this was in connection, so basically looking at how creative practices can get people to think differently about green infrastructure. Green infrastructure being the topic of a project I was involved in at the time with other colleagues at UT. So we're looking at the potential of green infrastructure to address the effects of climate change. So this is also interesting because, again, the site is very specific. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the campus at University of Twente. Okay, we see here some have. It was built. It was built on farmland. It was built on farmland, so you still have this sort of presence of old woodland, and there's some little farms around. So there's a sort of rural character to it, but you also have the urban character of course, many buildings. I think in some ways quite similar to what we have here, and also these kind of very manicured green spaces, right? So that to us kind of portrays a different sort of urban territory, not so much on a struggle like Luktemir Polder, but one which is both something that tells you of a more intimate relations with nature, but at the same time also kind of more alienating through all of these kind of very controlled environments. So this is actually what led us to play with words. So basically by the way we framed the workshop was not to look at green infrastructure, but to look for green intimacies. Also it's GI, right? So this for us also quite interesting how we could use the terminology differently to defamiliarize. And basically the aim of the workshop was to see whether experiencing green space through an emphasis on senses, on feelings, and also on sense of place could somehow get people to think, maybe to start to reimagine other possibilities for green space on the campus beyond just the more technical kind of characteristics of it. So to also think in terms of more effective or ecological dimensions. And the work, as I said, it was a workshop. So the walk part basically was developed as a sort of, or inspired by data walks. These were coming primarily from smart city design. But again, we kind of reconceived that more as an extended understanding of data. So people had to work in groups. They had different roles assigned to them and a toolkit. So they could take pictures that also from data. So these kind of instant cameras you see there, different notes, observations, but also physical objects or elements of non-living nature. So they brought all of these things back as a way to illustrate basically their subjective experiences of green intimacy with nature. When they came back, they had to basically patchwork their sort of subjective maps of the campus with this data. And this is what formed, let's say, their their subjective experience. So they had to annotate it with different, with what they felt about the spaces. So basically, what spaces in the campus actually illustrated to them this kind of green intimacy with nature. And then the next step, so basically in order for them to start to reimagine, so this was the more kind of co-design, featuring aspect of the workshop, the idea was to reshuffle the map of the campus in a way that those particular intimacies, so where they felt closest to nature, could also be amplified or expanded to other spaces. So basically to do that, they literally had to cut the maps that they had and kind of reorganize them in new patterns. This is also something that in the Rurban Futures Collective we were looking at. So basically, how can we repattern in a variety of ways post-growth futures? So of course, looking at repatterning quite literally green space was one of those ideas. And basically, in order to also kind of give a more narrative dimension to this, we asked them to write love letters to those spaces. So the spaces that kind of talk to them of this intimacy with nature. And it's quite interesting because, again, the whole idea of defamiliarization was to put them in a strange mode, right? So we did that in terms of how we frame green infrastructure, but also in terms of actually making maps, so completely messing up those maps to make them different. But we saw that defamiliarization actually led to a sort of becoming familiar again with nature in different ways. So the first letter here is addressed to Dear Mother, right? So nature becomes the mother again. But then we also have this sort of protected, augmented mushroom that somehow kind of helps us to reconnect. So we are underneath it, and it helps us reconnect. Indeed, so maybe we can rethink car parking spaces from the perspective. I don't know. So these are quite interesting dimensions of defamiliarizing and refamiliarizing. So just a few reflections. This is my last slide. Basically, these letters actually, if anyone happens to be on our campus, the artist has actually made them into tangible objects, so they exist on the campus. You can check them out, and you can also scan the QR code, and you get to this map, where you can see. Then in the future, we hope to actually make it interactive, so then students, people, whoever visit our campus, they can actually share their own intimacy with nature in these spaces. But basically, what can we take out of this? So what we observed is that by using artistic practices to generate this sort of effective urban encounters with green space, indeed, we could start to shift meanings. We open up, we kind of destabilized what was taken for granted, and people started to think about alternative possibilities that maybe they wouldn't have conceived otherwise. So in that sense, we think there's a lot of potential there for artistic method to actually open up these new conceptual worlds from which we can actually start to imagine how we can be and act in the world otherwise. And I think this is quite important because it's more in terms of mindsets and worldviews, because if you think about the workshops, they were very specific. So the sites, the issues were specific, the data. So if you think about the knowledge produced, cannot be directly seen as a solution which you immediately replicate and put somewhere else. That doesn't work like that.
It's not scalable.
It's not scalable. So who knows, maybe in terms of funding calls or something else, would be completely at a loss there. But what is interesting is that the mode of thinking, that is what we're thinking is really important to take forward, right? And that's something that we can actually start to, from that perspective, we can start to think about green space in other places from the kind of perspective of beyond a solution to a problem to actually something that opens up this space for multisensory knowledge production, becoming more familiar with nature and others, and also this kind of care for an ecosystem of humans and other species. So this is also what I would like to end with, that within this kind of context of designing for sustainability transformations and maybe also post-growth futures, there might be a role there for artistic practices to basically produce or kind of become these tools that allow us to start to see, so change mindset and perspectives, and from there think about maybe not so much about system change and solutions that are scalable, but more about open design processes that can allow us to move towards place-based transformations. So that's it.